Hello, everyone. The lecture today, lecture number 11 in the um, Introduction to Wiccan Theology lecture, deals with the building a body of lore. I elaborate on this quite a bit more in my book, Creating Lore, Writing Ritual, which I recommend to anybody who's got a few extra coins. But to begin, lore, briefly, is the body of common knowledge shared by a group of people. It is the things everyone knows, the things everybody needs to know, the way we do things. It's specialized in group knowledge, styles, technical expertise, and language that may or may not have any practical direct utility, but serves as a general framework of ideas and practices inside a particular group. It's a doxa. Hannah Blank, in her book Straight, The Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality, has an excellent description of doxa and how it is created in society as a folk process. There was a time, not that long ago, when a common set of reference points anchored our entire culture. There was a common store of stories, myths, and songs, as well as ideas about religion that were close to universally known. They were principally Christian stories and ideas, supplemented with Shakespeare, that were the common lore and property of our culture. Because of this lore, people of a range of backgrounds and differences could nonetheless easily and quickly communicate complex associations and ideas to each other with this shorthand of common symbols. It was a kind of cultural community property, a shared cultural capital. And here I refer you to Pierre Bourdieau's outline of a series of practice on the ideas of cultural capital. The Wiccan based religious movement also has an accumulated body of lore, which includes stories, history, rituals, songs, dances, myths, and theology. Some of these are things we borrowed or appropriated from other places, from other religions or cultures, from research into the origins of our beliefs and mythology, and even from popular fiction. But many of these things we have come up with, or the gods have given us. It's through this body of lore that we can make meaningful experiences and pass along insights about the divine and our relationship to it, and develop these insights together. We can rebuild a lost cultural and spiritual capital. Because of the belief that older ways and ideas are somehow more authentic, we don't prize our own creativity or acknowledge our folk processes nearly enough. But many traditions that claim to be ancient were actually created quite recently, and the claims of great antiquity are frequently part of the process of the creation of authenticity. In this book, in this lecture, rather, I'm going to say that what is authentic is what works without stealing intellectual or cultural property or lying about your origins. My rituals are frequently examples of bricolage, but I always cite sources and develop the ideas I borrow to suit my purposes and our beliefs. I recommend that you always acknowledge where you got stuff from. The religious movement really has several bodies of lore, which initially were inspired by the same things, but which have grown separately, one or more for each of the main approaches to our common religion. Groups of believers and practitioners accumulate common songs and stories which have value and meaning and are useful to them, but which are less useful to people who don't share their fundamental beliefs and assumptions and reference points. As ordinary pagans undertake research into the mythology and stories of the gods they're involved with, by reading some of the classic literature to understand how our ancestors interacted with them, and through performance of ritual and reflecting on it, a body of theology and references develops. By retelling the stories, writing and singing songs, and through the casual everyday relationships that believers will develop with the divine, and principally through our use of these ideas, chants, references, and so on, a body of lore comes into existence. Nothing too mysterious or complicated involved, and not something that only the grand poobah or exalted lore mistress of your group can do or talk about. These bodies of lore tend to be self-reinforcing and internally consistent. and that is, parts of it refer to other parts of it, although they are not monolithic and closed. Authors in the same stream of things tend to quote each other. Rituals refer to particular calendar dates. Particular myths and stories are referred to more often than others, and so on. And gradually, different bodies of lore become more and more distinct, and it becomes obvious that the groups using them are different from each other, although maybe still related. These bodies of lore also include the lists of what is important to know, ranging from herbalism to details of mythology and ritual, whether or not these things will ever be used. Often esoteric details or specialized knowledge are only used as markers of membership in a group and not for any practical purpose. Each overlapping body of lore is tied to practice, however, to religious and ritual practice, and it is the ritual-linked lore that I'm most interested in here. High church inner court and low church outer court work with the same general bodies of lore as do Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist groups, differing in the latter cases by how much they are willing to add in and expand past the clear boundaries of Wiccan ritual and beliefs. I tend to be conservative in that spectrum, generally developing a ritual and practice fairly similar to Gardnerian Wicca, but comfortable with experiment and mix and match within that overall approach. We also need to distinguish between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, between correct beliefs and practices. Again, I'm generally more interested here in practice than in beliefs. Now, lore develops ideologically. We choose which things to add and to emphasize based on what we already believe and do, rather than by a completely unbiased consideration of these new items. That isn't always a bad thing, because it results in a deeper and more complex exploration of these new items. It is this our ideas develop, and unless the group or individual doesn't realize that that's what we're doing, and we mistake our biases for objectivity. An unfortunate tendency to note here is the anti-modern reaction that underlies a great deal of popular folklore. There's a nostalgia for a never-never land before class struggle or racism, or the exploitation of the peasantry and the conquered peoples by the dominant groups and the cities, some fantasy of bucolic harmony, a pure and naive time long ago. This time never existed outside of fantasy novels and the Society for Creative Anachronism. There's always been class struggle, sexism, warfare, conquest, and the rest of it. This nostalgia, instead of research, results in highly partial and selective scholarship, collections of folk songs and tales that are pre-Baudelarized to suit the desire of the collector for this kind of unrealistic life, as Ian McKay demonstrated, for example, when he revisited Helen Creighton's famous collection of Nova Scotia folk songs and stories with an eye to what was deliberately not collected by her, among other things, labor songs and body songs, both of which are quite prominent in actual folklore. And the creation, of course, of the myth of Nova Scotia as a principally Scottish area. A related problem is the creation of the authorized real folklore list, like the child ballads predetermining what is real folk song, or the very selective and rewritten collections of the Grimm brothers representing the authentic German folk story, and so on. I'm not going to multiply examples endlessly or belabor my point. What we create is both authentic in its own right, but also likely shaped by our ideological biases. An easy divergence to see that's based on ideology is that between women-only groups and those that include both sexes, or amongst the different ethnic reconstructionist groups. Less obvious, but also real, are those groups which diverge around sexual preference or gender norms or ages or racism. The boundaries usually are not policed heavily, but they are obvious if one looks, and become very strong when a group has a charismatic leader or a strong external threat. Then your preferences can change to dogmatic requirements. Also, popular, charismatic, and talented individuals can have entirely disproportionate influence if their ideas and work are taken up and used by a large number of people in the movement. It's not a quality judgment to see that at this point in time in the pagan communities, the work of Silver Ravenwolf is more influential than Christopher Penksack. In my opinion, Penksack's a superior writer and thinker, but the lore of at least one large fraction of the Wicca-identified movement owes more to popular writers like Silver Ravenwolf, and another draws strongly from Starhawk and the reclaiming and fairy tradition, and so on. And ultimately, Wicca owes a tremendous debt to Aleister Crowley and the OTO and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn on the one hand, and Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society on the other. Layers of lore build on one another, they branch, and they recombine. Now, the center of Wicca must remain the mysteries and inner court, in my opinion, not the outer court groups. That mystical path of direct connection with the divine, not the casual drop-in groups that show up at temple meetings from time to time, or the I read a book instant priestesses. But just as the external forms and practices of different groups change with the changing lore, so do the mysteries that they center themselves on. Because a group differs from me or from you, does not necessarily mean that it has no substance to it. In the Wicca-identified paganisms, there are already several such bodies of lore and sets of mysteries which overlap but which are distinct. Those inside the specific communities can use these bodies of lore more effectively to accomplish spiritual connection and achieve goals for themselves than those outside of them. People read the same books and practice in the same way. What is usually happening is adaptation and variation of themes and the addition of related sources within established bodies of lore, rather than the creation of brand new ways of doing things, which I think is a very good thing, since brand new things are superficial matters of style until a number of people have been able to work with the new body of lore and deepen it. People inside each of the factions often assume, however, that their particular faction's lore and approach to it is the common agreed upon norm for the entire religious movement, and receive a bit of a shock when they venture out into the wider world. This is particularly true of those factions that are centered on the all-wise charismatic leader and her mastery of the secret lore. In Wicca-based paganism, there's a strong feeling that one should create one's own traditions. I would have to say that this freedom to create your own is substantially an illusion, and is one of the ideological assumptions of the reclaiming influence stream of things, or at least more so than any of the others. Individuals demand the authority to define themselves in all areas of life, but we also desire community, family, and meaning as members of social groups, and desire the pleasure of communion with others that are like us. Now, this can go to the extreme of tribalism sometimes, but each of us will acknowledge some need for a common belief and experience. This need for community means that we must define ourselves with others rather than continuing to pretend or trying to have total personal control over what beliefs, and more importantly, what practices, constitute Wiccan essentials. This doesn't mean imposing our definitions on anyone else, but it does mean thinking about what are reasonable boundaries to draw around our body of lore. These things are common projects and common property, which derive meaning and power not only from individuals' experiences, but from the group that defines them and through which they were jointly created. These are social products, not idiosyncratic acts of heroic individual artistic creativity, and not the special secret property of the all-knowing lore master. We can, in other words, jointly decide what are the things that are certainly Wiccan ideas and practices, likely to be included, not so likely, and not included, so that we can go deeper and not just sprawl out more widely. But without some way of accumulating and passing on a body of lore, nothing consistent can continue. So we'll need to think about and act on this need, and to consciously undertake the reclamation and revival of folk tradition, rather than decrying our lack of authentic tradition or inventing deep roots that are historically questionable. Why not acknowledge and own our own creative folk expression? And as a corollary need, We have to effectively pass along the lore, teach it, and make it second nature, particularly the non-intuitively obvious ideas and techniques. And I'm afraid we have to accept that different factions draw the boundaries in different places, and that we are not all practicing the same religion, even if we give it the same name. Now, I've previously dealt with the problem of passing along the lore in my book, The Uses of Ecstasy. Let me recommend Harvey Whitehouse's books and his cognitive theory of ritual as well. I'll briefly deal with it later on in the discussion. To the annoyance of the big tent-minded peoples, these definitions that absolutely everyone can agree on fall very short of what anyone would base their personal or group practice on. The texts, the rituals and other lore, the techniques of magic, trance and the rest of it, who the authorities are that they cite in support of their version of Wiccan practice, and so on. Each body of lore has different key reference points with some overlap, and some quite sharp conflicts about legitimacy and inclusion, as for example the argument around Ron Hutton versus Philip Heselton's views of the antiquity of the Gardnerian traditions, or the various conflicting myths of Wicca's origins. Hutton's book, The Triumph of the Moon, and Philip Heselton's Wiccan Roots, Gerald Gardner and the Modern Witchcraft Revival, are worth consulting for this. I think of our religious movement as a community of communities, rather than a collection of individuals. Those who feel that Wicca is a purely individualistic path are right to be suspicious of people like me, because that's not what I'm about. On the other hand, as I have no authority to compel anyone to accept my distinctions, and I don't want that authority either, and I don't accept that authority over me from anyone else, we all must engage in respectful dialogue around these questions and agree to differ about details. Or we must cease to try to have a common religious project. However, as a general case, and away from the specifics of our teacher or our faction of the community's body of lore, I believe that we all have a general sense of what is undoubtedly Wiccan, what may be Wiccan, what's probably not Wiccan, and what's not Wiccan, although it may be perfectly valid for those who like that sort of thing. If we accept that Wicca has a set of beliefs and practices which are typically Wiccan, although some will be found elsewhere, the questions are, what are they? And which beliefs and practices that are not Wiccan are acceptable in Wiccan practice, and why? And what reasonable set of criteria can be used to make these distinctions? If, for the purposes of making it possible to build a Wiccan religious community, we accept the value of making these distinctions, this is really where we must begin. I don't believe that any belief or practice is undoubtedly, undeniably, utterly, essentially Wiccan for everyone. The basic ritual pattern, or the quartered circle, probably comes closest, and the charge of the goddess. There are some that have very strong arguments in favor, and others where the arguments are much weaker. The "and ye harm none," as well as a lot of other ethics statements, are later additions to the canon, for example, not found in the original Books of Shadows. The threefold law originally read more or less, "As you are harmed, return 3 times, but remember that you are obliged to repay good 3 times. And that was a part of the initiation ritual for second degree, and not a general purpose moral injunction, which is what it's currently often cited as. And in many cases, it's really a matter of taste and function. We could make better decisions about where we wanted to go together and how to get there just by thinking about, why we wanted to do these things. By distilling the theological messages to essentials, adopting a cell-like structure, abandoning unnecessary ecclesiastical and theological sophistication, and clinging to the central messages and experience of the religion, we can facilitate rapid reproduction and networking. It's not complicated and doesn't take a great deal of study to master the foundation ideas of a given branch of Wicca. By the adoption of a movement orientation and encouraging free flow of ideas and discussion, theological and ritual innovation can be encouraged without being the exclusive property of one group or teacher or contained in one set of scriptures. Although the ideas are simple, it should be difficult to join a coven, difficult to qualify initiation, but simple to participate once you're in it. Participation in temple activities, which are basically outer court versions of the teachings and rituals, must be even more approachable. This doesn't mean that we do not speak of profound or important things, but we do so through the simplest language and with the most direct means possible, and we consider liturgy and ritual development and performance vitally important. We also understand the importance and difficulty of character training in building the foundation for our religious service, particularly as clergy. We aren't interested in a consumerist approach. The performance of ritual and the experience of it will unfold meaning to the person who has the experience, although not immediately and only with genuine effort. Consumerism reduces religion to a commodity and ultimately to money alone. So Wiccans do not charge money for teachings, nor provide simple study guides to ritual and theology as a substitute for experience and effort. A position, by the way, that is part of my faction of the community's accepted lore. The experience of meaning through effectively performed and well thought out ritual needs to unfold over time and with repeated exposure and personal reflection. We aim to produce in ourselves a shared set of understandings about the way the spiritual intersects with the world and a set of habits of virtue and a way of responding to it. There's a bunch of authorities that we can use to understand our movements, origins, and developments from them. Gerald Gardner and the source material he drew from Aleister Crowley, Geoffrey Leyland, Eliphas Livy, the Key of Solomon the King, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and Theosophy via co-masonry. Ronald Hutton, Janet and Stuart Farrer, and others depending on the question you're asking. Starhawk, Pagan Way of Chicago, Monica Schuh, Zed Budapest, and others, plus Aristotle for the syllogism and virtue ethics, Socrates for the Euthyphro dialogue and others, Homer, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, Jeanette Paris, James Hillman, Thomas Moore, Roberto Colasso, the Eddas. These and many others, these, by the way, are ones that I have cited through these lectures. These and many others will be sources for our bodies of lore, and the inclusion of one or two key sources is often a way of distinguishing families of lore. I also need to credit academic theories of ritual and the work of folklorists, archaeologists, and others. Wiccans have borrowed ideas widely from these academic disciplines, unfortunately often holding on to older work much longer than useful, as with the great ancient matriarchy theories and the theory of pagan survivals, both of which were once quite respectable but are no longer held in much regard in the academic community. Ultimately, each of us must be the authority for ourselves. Even if we give over the authority to the Bible or Teen Witch, it is ours to surrender. And I'm an authority as a third degree with 40 years of experience, just not the only authority. I hope to be very clear that I'm answerable to the members of my groups and to the gods, but not to the larger Wicca-based pagan milieu. I disagree with many of them about organization, and also, it seems to me, around this question of a body of lore. And the community is not of one mind either. All religions are not variations on one true religion, and in particular, Christianity is not the gold standard. I'm not a non-Christian. I'm a Wiccan priest. Wiccan ways cannot just borrow undigested bits and pieces of other people's religions and end up with anything that fits together and works for us on our own terms. We need to say positively who we are and to develop our traditions and lore consciously, not just organically, which typically means without thinking about it randomly and based on unspoken and unexamined assumptions, which leads to us basically recreating the patriarchy in drag. We also cannot, not any longer, say that there's only one Wicca and that we all have the same basic outlook. The various factions are sisters or cousins, but not the same.